Ja. Misschien moeten we een paar minuutjes wachten tot iets na 3. Of iets na 3, 4 minuten na 7.
Ja.
Oké, de livestream is gestart. Hè.
Nee. En heb je het ook al op Facebook gezet?
denk dat we wel kunnen beginnen, hè?
Heb je nu alle beelden centraal?
Ja, nu is het aan jou.
Right. So, welcome everybody. It's a little bit strange to not see any audience. I only see a list of names at the side of Zoom. So it's the first online KASKlezing ever, I think. And I guess it won't be the last, since we heard that the restrictions are getting stronger in KASK. So probably there will be more lectures online, and we have to see, because we only know it since today, about the new restrictions. So we have to see what this means. For me, it's still a bit vague, but I can imagine that people from abroad won't be able to travel. Like Jonathan Burrows from the UK, think it's tricky. People from Paris, maybe it's possible. Like with Thomas Hirschman, it's possible, but we have to see. So I don't know. It's also a bit the first time that we will figure out, at least for me, how we do this. So our guest of tonight is Jonas Staal, as you probably know. Jonas Staal is an artist working with democracy and propaganda, or mainly focusing on this and asking questions about what is the possibility of a state in the 21st century. Since the topic of his lecture will be his practice, he will start from the beginning of his practice, I think, and continuing to more present topics. So I don't think it's really necessary to summarize this in a couple of sentences, but maybe it's interesting to point out the reason that I invited Jonas Staal. The reason is that I was very intrigued by his project New World Summit that he started in 2012, where these elements of the role of a nation state, the function of a state, the possibilities of a state, like what could be a future state, were quite present. And besides a purely artistic element, this was also a political tool. And one of the states he was looking into was the Kurdistan state in Rojava. The new parliament was settled there. That was an autonomous region in Syria. In Syria, and it was really a stateless democracy, that the people's parliament, and the stories that came out of there. And I think Jonas Staal was definitely one of the voices that was helping very much to give attendance to this voice. And this was something I think very beautiful was happening there. And then last year, the Turks entered, and like this utopia, or something that sounded like me utopia, what was threaded, and I think probably it's almost demolished, but this is maybe something that Jonas will go in deeper. And at least I thought this is something very important, and something that we have to discuss, like what is going on there, and something that we definitely have to give visibility to, as Jonas was already doing for quite some years. So that's the reason. Maybe it's also important to mention that, of course, he's a visual artist, but his writings are very interesting. You can find them on eFlux, you can find them in books, you can find them in a lot of places. I think it's a very interesting artist, since he's not only making artworks, but is also very much thinking, how can art function, how can the world function, what are the restrictions from art or not, and mainly focusing on not, I would say. So yeah, I would say I wish you all a very, normally I would say please put your hands together, but this is a bit difficult now. But maybe something to add, like after the lecture, there will be the possibility to ask questions, and then you can raise your hand, but on a digital way. I don't know exactly how it is, but apparently you can push something that we see a hand, and then we can allow you to ask a question. So Claire is luckily here to assist us with everything. But now I would give the word to Jonas Staal.
Thank you, Godard, and for the invitation, for the introduction, and thank you, Simone and Claire, for co-organizing the meetings I had today with some of the artists at KASK, and for organizing this lecture, of course. So I'm going to talk tonight. Let's see if you can see. Have I already shared my screen? No, for some reason not. Let's do that now. So you should be able to see my screen now. So I want to talk to you tonight about two aspects of my work. As Godard already said, this is a lecture aimed to introduce some of the key topics and projects that I've been working on in the last 15, 20 years or so. The first part of the talk, I will focus on what I refer to as propaganda research, and the second part will focus on what I refer to as propaganda work. So I'm a visual artist, but I'm also a propaganda researcher, and these two endeavors inform the presentation tonight. So important is to start first maybe with the question, what does this term, this contentious term, propaganda, what does it mean exactly? And in my research, I argue that propaganda cannot be reduced to a single poster or a single film or a single monument. Because the aim of propaganda is not just to send a message. It's not just a merely communicative tool. The aim of propaganda is to construct entirely new realities. And historically speaking, of course, when we talk about propaganda, we very quickly think of the terrifying regimes of Nazi Germany, of Stalinist rule in the Soviet Union. But it is also a mistake to think that propaganda originated from dictatorship. The first modern propaganda bureau was founded by the imperial democracy of the United Kingdom at the beginning of the First World War. And according to Hitler's diaries, it was actually Hitler's belief that the First World War was lost due to the propaganda endeavor, what he calls the superior propaganda endeavor of the British. And he would model his own propaganda apparatus based on that of the British. Of course, that's not to say that the propaganda of the United Kingdom is the same as the propaganda of Nazi Germany. Obviously, it's not, but most certainly they both engaged in propaganda endeavors. And it also means that this idea that somehow propaganda emerged from dictatorship is wrong. It emerged from the imperial democracy of the United Kingdom. On top of that, there are many legacies of alternative takes, alternative approaches to propaganda in the history of anti-colonial struggle, socialist movements, Black liberation struggle, feminist, ecological movements. Ideas on propaganda as an emancipatory practice, as a transformative practice. Propaganda as a way of propagating new imaginaries, propagating new visions of alternative forms of society, of alternative forms of egalitarian society. Obviously, then we're talking about propagandas that stand in stark contrast to that of the imperial democracy of the United Kingdom or Nazi Germany for that matter. In other words, this is not to talk about propaganda theory, but just as a very short context. In other words, we must speak of propagandas in the plural. There's not a single propaganda. Propagandas differ depending on the kind of power that we're dealing with. An anti-colonial movement produces a different kind of propaganda because it's a different structure of power. It follows a different imaginary than the colonial state, for example. So there are different structures of power and they generate different propagandas in the plural. So my artistic work deals with propaganda research on the one hand to map how oppressive forms of power use art and culture to create these new realities. And on the other hand, my work is invested in exploring alternative forms of emancipatory propaganda, exploring the role of art to propagate, to imagine, mobilize, agitate alternative egalitarian worlds into being. So I want to start very quickly with some early works just to give you a little bit of context of where my work comes from. It's mainly interventionist works made in public space, generally made anonymously, without permission. And these are works dedicated to deconstructing what you could call dominant master narratives through visual means. So what's a master narrative? In propaganda theory, the master narrative is basically the origin story we tell, where we come from, who we are, and who we are supposed to become. Or in the case of the master narratives, the kind of oppressive master narratives of the Trumpist regime, for example, the famous Make America Great Again. There we have a master narrative that claims a past greatness, a time of a great white Christian sovereign nation that is projected that defines the struggle of the present and is projected as a horizon into the future. Of course, that is a very strange kind of retro science fiction, as we often see in ultra-nationalist propagandas, because we're talking about a past that never existed in the first place, that is then projected as a common future. And the figure that you see depicted here in an early work, the Geert Wilders works, is well, you could say a Trump before Trump. Geert Wilders, leader of the ultra-nationalist Freedom Party in the Netherlands, is still in parliament today. A party very similar, follows very similar racist and white supremacist policies as the Front National, these days the Rassemblement National in France, or the Alternative for Germany in Germany, or the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Unfortunately, we are living in a time in which ultranationalist and fascist platforms like the one of Wilders are emerging across the world. So what you see here is a photo from a police file of one of 21 works I made anonymously in this kind of memorial works. You often see them spontaneously placed along roadsides, often relating to famous public figures, like the seas of flowers and teddy bears and photographs that emerged after the death of Princess Diana. Obviously, I made them in a period in which Wilders was not dead, was not deceased. But an important aspect of his platform is that he has used in his anti-Islamic rhetoric specifically, he has often used the fact that he is threatened by supposedly Islamic terrorist organizations as a way to prove the legitimacy of his political platform. So the fact that he threatens Muslim minorities leads to him being threatened by particular individuals or groups. He lives with a bulletproof vest, permanent security. So he has used a kind of sacrificial narrative to fuel his political platform. I Wilders, sacrifice myself for the defense of the white Christian sovereign nation of the Netherlands. But of course, he's a very paradoxical martyr, because he's a martyr that never dies. He's in a permanent sacrifice, almost as a kind of zombie-like political figure. And that is what I was trying to visualize through this series of anonymous installations. Wilders interpreted these works as a threat to his life, and in the process, I was arrested and prosecuted for 3 years, which you can see here depicted in a court drawing by another artist, Jan Hensema. It's very interesting that in the context of the courtroom, if you want to document, you can't rely on photography because it's not allowed in the courtroom, so you have to rely on another artist. So I'm the third person from the left, this quite old-looking man, considering that this was about 15 years ago. And this court case was important for me in the sense that I announced it as an inherent part of the work, as the court case as a space, as an arena of contestation, a space where different master narratives, different stories around these artworks I made could be told and could confront one another. We have the story of Wilders as I'm being threatened by a supposedly left-wing artist. There was my story, which said I made a series of work that depicts the paradoxical figure of the living martyr and his perpetual sacrifice. And there was a narrative of the law that was supposed to order these narratives and come to a form of truth finding. And I think that this let's say, thinking of my own work also in this as a process, as something that cannot be reduced to a singular artwork. The installations, the memorial works, they are artworks, but they provoke responses. These responses translate into the courthouse, and then the courthouse for a period of 3 years became the arena where I could continue the that had led to these first interventions in the first place. This process component is for me very important. Another example of this more interventionist practice is a work called Be Free or Else, Wees vrij of anders in Dutch. It's a work that consists, as you can see, of two airplanes that fly these two texts over the skies of Amsterdam on May 5th, 2010, and May 5th in the Netherlands is Liberation Day. It's the day that the Netherlands celebrates through this huge consumer fest that you can see here, its liberation from Nazi oppression. Of course, this Freedom Day took place some years after the attacks of September 11, the ongoing war on terror, the invasion in Afghanistan, the invasion in Iraq, in which the Netherlands participated as well. And that changed very much our representation or our visual conceptualization of freedom. The blue skies and these two planes, referencing, of course, also the two planes of that crashed into the Twin Towers, no longer stand necessarily for a space of infinite possibilities or great mobility. Suddenly the blue sky is this source of terror, out of which from at any moment attacks against supposedly attacks against capitalist democratic societies could take place. At the same time, we saw that the notion of freedom in the war on terror gained an increasingly violent component. The invasion in Afghanistan, the invasion in Iraq were legitimized as being necessary to bring freedom militarily, to bring freedom through more than a decade of occupation, to bring freedom that would lead to the rise of the Islamic State and the perpetual destabilization of the region. So we also see that here freedom becomes a kind of violent dictate. It's be free or else expect invasion, expect enforced policies from the Western world, the global North. And of course, there's a contrast, the contrast between these different conceptualizations of freedom, as I just mentioned them, in the sky, represented through the blue sky and the two airplanes and the texts. And then there is this kind of consumer, this liberal hedonist consumer based celebration of freedom that mainly takes place through this kind of, well, public party, excessive drinking and things like that. So it was a work which on various ways was trying to deconstruct the dominant narratives, the master narratives around our conceptualization and practice of freedom today. Now, in later works, different than in my more interventionist practices, these works that I created in public space, I started to map the use of art and culture in propaganda more structurally. I think these earlier works in a certain way were more interventionist, were more of something that created commentary or mirrored existing questions, existing political questions and narratives. In my propaganda research, it became something more structural, a more structural attempt to understand how do dominant forms of power use art and culture to create their own realities. An example of this is a project called Closed Architecture, a project I created in 2011, which was centered around the figure of Fleur Agema that you see here. Fleur Agema is the number 2 still today of the Freedom Party led by Geert Wilders that I mentioned in the very first work, the Geert Wilders works. And the Freedom Party, from its start, has fiercely fought against what they consider left-wing art, the indoctrination of artists to serve left-wing agendas, to propagate for multicultural society and diversity. And that made it all the more relevant to find out that Fleur Agema, the number 2 on the list, and myself actually went to the same art school, quite a progressive art school, the AKI in Enschede in the Netherlands. So I went into the archives to try to find out what this ultranationalist politician, formerly artist, what exactly it was that she had been researching, that she had been working on in the school. And I came across this 350-page document, her master thesis, called Closed Architecture. And Closed Architecture, her graduation work, is essentially a detailed model for an alternative prison. And at the moment that I came across this thesis, her party had actually just entered into government. So it was also a relevant question to ask, how does this thesis, how does this conceptualization of a prison model by Agema, how does it inform the government policies that we would be facing in the years to come? So consequently, I worked with a team of architects to translate her thesis into visual models, as you can see here, architectural models, 3D reconstruction of the prison, a video, a theater play, an attempt to visualize exactly how exactly the the artistic practice of Agema could or would impact public policy in the Netherlands. So what you see here is a drawing by Agema herself. It's a prison cell from her model that we translated as such in a digital form. And essentially, Agema's prison model is a phased prison model. It exists in four phases that literally go from dark to light. So in the first phase that you see here, the cells are extremely small, darkened, there's only one window, and with every next phase that you enter into, an additional window appears, the spaces become lighter, particular consumer products are added to incentivize the prison, almost like in a video game, to move forward into different levels of the prison, which leads to the final level of the prison, which is called the light. The first phase is called the bunker, and the last phase is called the light. Here you see Agema's drawing, and here you see the translation, the digital translation that we made. This, of course, this prison model has a very dangerous logic, because the idea is that if you follow certain learning objectives, you move forward into the prison, you can liberate yourself. But if you don't, then you go backwards into the prison. So an activist who out of principle would not follow the dictates of the prison would forever remain stuck in the first level, whereas someone else might move out who's willing to follow these guidelines might move out much quicker. And what is very interesting and characteristic of this fourth phase, the final phase of the prison, is that actually you're not even really aware that you're still in a prison. It is made in such a way that it looks like a kind of upper middle class neighborhood with a lot of recreational space and different shops. There are no longer any guards visible. There's 24/7 security cameras installed. So in the final phase of the prison, we are no longer really sure if we are still in the prison as prisoners. And of course, that says something very important about the type of society that the party of Agema, the Freedom Party, is aiming to build. One that is structurally surveilled, extremely class regimented, based on a white supremacist political paradigm. Essentially, we're talking her model is not so much the model of a prison, it's a model of society as prison, society becoming itself a prison. And here in the final image, you see, it's a bit of a dark image, but you see a spatial reconstruction of the four cells from each of the different phases of the prison model. And on the top screen, you see the bottom of the cell and the passing of daylight throughout a single day. That shows how the regimentation of light reflects the phase of liberation in which a prisoner has moved him or herself. Now, these examples of propaganda research focus specifically on ultranationalist, today we would say alt-right, political ideologies, but that is not exceptionally the case. A work that I made from 2013 to 2017 called Monument to Capital looked, for example, in the way in which global capitalism as an ideological formation, as a form of contemporary power, structures also from an architectural perspective our daily lives, our daily living environments. So what you see here is the starting point of the Monument to Capital project, and that is the Barclays Capital Skyscraper Index. Now, Barclays is not an architectural firm or a theoretical agency, but a financial investment agency. They advise clients on where to invest in real estate, for example. And in this model, they argue that the history of the highest buildings of the world run parallel to economic crisis. So from the Life Equity building in 1873, that was built just at the beginning of an economic crisis, to the Burj Khalifa, currently the highest building of the world in Dubai. They argue there is a structural relationship between economic crisis and the highest buildings of the world. And when a country announces the building of a new highest building, that is a reason to divest from from investment into property. Because it indicates a coming boom, a coming exploding bubble of real estate, of the real estate market. And this for me was an extremely interesting given that there would be this correlation, that the highest building of the world essentially monumentalize, materialize the deepest point of the Dow Jones index of global crises. And that normally we tend to look at each of these highest buildings of the world in a very particular, in a particular context, in a particular geography, from the perspective of a particular architect, but that actually the real architectural drawing is the reversed Dow Jones index. If we put it upside down, the moments where it goes deepest are the points that are highest, and in these deepest points we could draw the highest buildings. In a way, the economic crisis, or let's say the Dow Jones graphs, form the reverse architectural drawing of this monument to capital, this global construction of buildings that represent power and wealth exactly at the moment power and wealth are dissipating from society. So here you see the kind of ghost construction of the highest buildings of the world next to the current highest building of the world, as if it is a singular construction developed through a singular algorithm that follows from the daily dynamics of high finance and global capitalism. This research in the way that different structures of power influence, impact art and architecture, I've also applied to certain art world infrastructures itself. And an example in this case is the ideological guide to the Venice Biennial, a project I made for the 2013 edition of the Venice Biennial, and it existed of a free smartphone app. You can see 4 screenshots here. And the smartphone app provided information on the political, economic, and ideological contexts of each national pavilion of the Venice Biennial of that year. So that goes from how was an artist selected? Was it through a public commission? Was it directly appointed by the government? What is the budget of a pavilion? What are the current political or economic conflicts of the country, and how do these reflect what is being presented in the pavilion at that time? It was a way of showing the Venice Biennial as a kind of alternative world map in which different embassies on behalf of nation states use art and culture to propagate for their social, political, and cultural agenda. And an important feature of the app was you could download it for free for Apple and Apple phones, and now I forgot what was the other iOS, the other operating system. One of important feature was the possibility to plan routes. So once in Venice, you could plan routes based on geopolitical alliances, routes between the pavilions. So all countries that belong to the G8, to the Coalition of the Willing that invaded Iraq, or to the non-aligned movement. So it was also a way of showing how different geopolitical formations are infrastructurally scripted, monumentalized within the context of the Venice Biennial, where, to no surprise, colonial countries are generally centered around Giardini, the kind of elite hub of the Venice Biennial, whereas post-colonial countries, in many cases, are placed outside of this former center of power. So we can also see a history, colonial history and imperialist history, that is crystallized in the infrastructure in the Venice Biennial. So the app essentially tried to do 2 things: to show the larger social, political, economic, ideological conditions that define why we see what we see in each pavilion of the Venice Biennial, but it also tried to turn the Venice Biennial into a kind of alternative world map, where the history of colonial and imperialist power can be traced, is physically mapped, and we as visitors perform these geopolitical alliances, walking from one pavilion to the other, choosing to start in Giardini in the colonial heart, or choosing to circumvent it. Maybe a last example, the most recent chapter in my propaganda research is a project called Steve Bannon, a propaganda retrospective. Now, for those who are not familiar with who is Steve Bannon, I envy you. But let me give you a little bit of context nonetheless. Steve Bannon is the ideologue of Trump, of Donald Trump, his campaign manager in the 2016 election. He's also the founder of the alt-right Breitbart news network. But lesser known is that Bannon also created 10 films, 10 documentary films in a period of 15 years before joining the Trump campaign, and he made one after Trump was elected. And apart from creating these films, he was involved in various other cultural projects and endeavors that are very telling for the role that he played in putting the Trumpist regime into power and scripting its core ideological narratives and ideas. So here you see an impression of the exhibition project, the Steve Bannon and Propaganda Retrospective exhibition project. It was 5 rooms in a new institute in Rotterdam, which one by one traced how Bannon's involvement in different political movements over the last 15 to 20 years and the cultural projects he developed laid the ground for the Trumpist regime, for the Make America Great Again narrative to take hold. So it essentially shows how his artistic and cultural imagination predated the political reality of the election of Trump. And there are some curious and seemingly contradictory projects he was involved with, amongst which, at the start of the exhibition, this is a case study that is being discussed, Biosphere 2 in Oracle, Arizona. Biosphere 2 is still, up until the day of today, the largest ever closed ecosystem that has ever been created on Earth. It replicates various different geographic conditions, climate conditions from across the world. At the time that Bannon, who has a background in Goldman Sachs investment banking, was invited to join the project as CEO, it was a project. The Biosphere was in a deep financial crisis. It was originally meant to test the possibility to create biospheres on Mars, for example, to create closed ecosystems to survive in interplanetary colonization. But it proved to be not to be feasible. Insects and particular animals were taking over parts of the biosphere. And Bannon essentially was brought in, and he proposed, let's use, due to the excess of CO2 in the air in the biosphere, let's use this infrastructure to test the consequences of climate change, how different animals and plant life respond to climate change. That stands in great contradiction to the fact that, in great tension with the fact that it was Bannon who convinced Trump to leave the Paris Climate Accord. It shows also the flexibility of the ideological flexibility of the propagandist. But essentially what is interesting about Biosphere is that it also stands as a metaphor for propaganda. Propaganda in the beginning not as a mere act of messaging, but propaganda really as an act of creating entirely new immersive realities, closed systems of thought, closed system of narratives, closed systems of particular symbols to enforce the interests of a particular regime. So we can see the biosphere in that sense as a kind of metaphor for the alt-right biosphere that Bannon would be creating in the years to follow. Now, most prominently analyzed in the exhibition project are Bannon's films. As I mentioned, he makes a kind of documentary. Well, it's not exactly documentary film. It's more kind of documentary film pamphlet. It uses the documentary form, but they are highly ideologically charged. He calls it a form of kinetic cinema. A kinetic cinema that, in his words, is built on the heritage of filmmakers such as Sergei Eisenstein, Leni Riefenstahl, and Michael Moore. Now, of course, these are the most contradictory type of references that you could imagine. Eisenstein was an important avant-garde filmmaker in the early years of the Soviet Revolution. Leni Riefenstahl was, of course, the filmmaker of the Nazi Third Reich. And Michael Moore is a liberal Democrat who has been making films critical of the former George W. Bush administration. But here we, of course, also see a key signature of the contemporary alt-right that uses this very contradictory messaging to destabilize, to confuse opponents about their real intentions. Of course, in the case of Bannon, as is the case with many alt-right actors, the reference to Riefenstahl should be the one that is taken most seriously. And the aim of kinetic cinema, in Bannon's words, is to overwhelm an audience, to produce narratives so intense, so relentless that a viewer would succumb to the stories and especially the solutions being proposed. So what you see here is a wall with 10 screens, and these 10 screens show all the dominant visual metaphors that appear throughout all of Bannon's films. So it's a kind of complete overview of all of his films without actually showing them, only showing the kind of core narrative through dominant visual metaphors used throughout his work. An example here is his use of images of storms and natural catastrophes. Of course, there's not much natural about them in the era of climate catastrophe, and Bannon would know that, considering that he led the Biosphere 2 project to focus on climate change. But okay, apart from that, in Bannon's films, storms, looming storms, earthquakes, images of collapsing ice, they always indicate a kind of a prophetic, almost prophetic turn. They signal a coming clash of civilizations, a great civilizational war, and that in Bannon's eyes is waged between white Christian economic nationalists, very much the core ideas of Trumpism on one hand, who fight against the threats, the multi-headed threats of cultural Marxism, so socialists, Marxists, the globalist elite, and Islamic terrorism. And he believes that he believes in a kind of almost prophetic, generational struggle that has to be waged to reinforce these dominant ideas, the doctrine of white Christian economic nationalism. Another visual metaphor that very much follows from these storms is disintegrating dollar bills, flying around, being flushed, being burned. It's almost as if the natural storm translates very insidiously into these what looks like almost like a natural phenomena of burning, of flying, whirlwinds of dollar bills, and which represent in Bannon's eyes the disintegration of all value the moment a society abandons the nuclear family, being guided by religious institutions, by divine entities like God-like figures. At that moment, value itself starts to evaporate. So we have here a very forceful, apocalyptic narrative that reappears in all of his films, before introducing a kind of savior figure, strongman. His early films deal with figures like Ronald Reagan. His later films obviously deal with our propaganda films to promote Trump, who are then the figures who, after being overwhelmed by these narratives of catastrophe, clashes of civilization, will lead into a new era of prosperity, a reinforcing of the basic doctrine that I just mentioned before. So out of this powerlessness that kinetic cinema is trying to instill upon the viewer comes this moment of release, the moment of strongman appearance. Now, of course, Bannon himself is also an embodiment of the tragic faith of propagandists in the context of authoritarian regimes. In the year after Trump was elected, he became more and more discomfortable with Bannon, who was often attributed the ingenious power of having put Trump into office. And as a result, slowly Bannon was removed from the administration, removed from the story of Trumpism. And that tells us something that Boris Groys, art historian and theorist Boris Groys, referred to as the total art of Stalinism. That in the end, in authoritarian propaganda, only the leader is the propagandist. Only Stalin tells the history of Stalin. Only Trump tells the history of Trump. So in the total art of Trumpism, as you can see from the photo left to the photo right, very similar to the way that Trotsky was removed from photos appearing next to Stalin. Here it is Bannon that is being removed from his position next to Trump. The power the propaganda artist thought he had, in the end, belonged only to the director of the total work of arts of the authoritarian government, that is that of Trump, and that is, of course, Trump himself. So that hopefully gives something of an impression of what I mean with propaganda research, the attempt to map and to visualize how dominant forms of power, whether this regards global capitalism or the alt-right, how they employ art and culture to shape realities after their interests. What I want to do now in the second part is to shift to the subject of propaganda work. So this is the part of my practice that explores the role of art in creating spaces for alternative narratives to dominant propaganda, so dominant propaganda master narratives, to instead propagate for egalitarian forms of life. It's what I refer to as emancipatory forms of propaganda. So, and in my practice, as you will see in a moment, this tends to translate into artworks that take the form of organizations. Artworks as alternative parliaments, as alternative campaigns, training camps, even lawsuits. So attempts to propagate alternative forms of life, alternative forms of political organization, as Godard also mentioned in the beginning of his introduction, through art. So the first example, also mentioned by Godard, is the New World Summit. It's an artistic and political organization that I founded in 2012. And that essentially exists out of alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. Here you see an example in the Sophiensäle Theater in Berlin. It was part of the 7th Berlin Biennial. So the parliament in this case takes the form of this installation, architectural construction space of political assembly. In this case, surrounded by flags that belong to organizations that were blacklisted at the time in the context of the war on terror. And if you will note that they are placed, organized by color, they create this kind of abstract color scheme, which of course in each of the flags belongs to a very specific political struggles. Now, the alternative parliaments of the New World Summit invite organizations placed on so-called terrorist blacklists, invites organizations that have that live through enforced conditions of statelessness, to challenge the dominant us versus them divide that has been cultivated in the war on terror. So when you are placed on a blacklist, on a terrorist blacklist, it means passports are revoked, bank accounts are frozen, a travel ban is installed. You are essentially declared stateless, which is very cynical because many organizations on terrorist blacklists are already stateless organizations, are already stateless peoples, whether we're talking about Kurds or the West Papuans. So it's a kind of double negation. Blacklisting a stateless person, declaring a stateless person stateless is a kind of double negation of their existence. And the blacklist has very often also been used to get rid of organizations that form a threat to the status quo, but that are not necessarily a threat to democracy, as has been always the story told by the war on terror. The terrorist attacks Western capitalist democracy because they hate freedom. Well, here in the first assembly of the New World Summit in Berlin, you see organizations from left to right, the Basque independence movement, Kurdish women's movement, the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, the National Liberation Movement of Azawad, Tuareg-led liberation movement in the northern part of Mali. All of these organizations stem from long histories of anti-colonial liberational struggle. They certainly have concepts, defend concepts of democracy, but concepts of democracy often too radical for capitalist democracy to deal with. So we try to create through these alternative parliaments. You see here the 4th edition of the New World Summit, a parliament created in the Royal Flemish Theatre in Brussels. We try to create these spaces in a way to challenge this us versus them narrative, this us versus them story that underlies the war on terror. Is it possible that we as citizens, politicized citizens of countries that have waged the war on terror, as citizens who oppose this war on terror, is it possible that we have more in common with the groups attacked in this war than with the states that claim to speak and act in our name? Can we use the space of art, the space of the alternative parliament, to recompose what is us in relationship to what is them, to not just challenge the master narrative of the war on terror, but to recompose new collectivities, new shared solidarities in the process. Now, of course, now I mainly mentioned the political dimension of what the parliaments, these stateless parliaments for stateless peoples, were trying to achieve. Of course, there's also a visual and a morphological approach. We, in collaboration with the team of the New World Summit, we very much have been thinking of the parliament as a theatrical space, as a performative space, as a space in which every component matters. How many people can be in a space before they no longer feel that they are part of the same collectivity, before you become a witness and an audience to an audience that feels external to you? What are the mathematical limits of democracy? How to distribute light equally? The importance of having speakers speak from the public, not towards the public, the spatial choreographies that create new political intimacies and sense of solidarity, and even questions about the usages of chairs compared to benches. We always use benches because benches are a space that is democratically negotiated. One person on a bench is a full bench, but 10 people on the bench are also a full bench. Whereas the chair is very much this liberal construct. A chair can only be empty or full, and our eyes are always pulled towards the empty chair in a space, as if the absent are more important than the present. Now, these might seem very unnecessary details to go into, but thinking about the parliament as a morphological space, a performative space, a sculptural space to a certain extent, from these, let's say, larger conceptual forms. For example, how the circle relates to square or oval, how the spatial configuration impacts how we build a sense of communality, to the smallest components, the chair versus the bench. They have been very important parts of the artistic considerations underlying the alternative parliaments, of which you see here an edition that we organized in Oslo, in the City Hall in Oslo. Now, the most recent chapter of the New World Summit is a very particular one. Godard also already mentioned it. It relates to one of the groups that has been involved with the New World Summit from the start, the Kurdish Revolutionary Movement, which in 2012, in parallel actually to the first edition of the New World Summit in 2012, in the midst of the Syrian civil war, declared the northern part of Syria, which is the western part of Kurdistan, known as Rojava, independent. They declared it independent from the Assad regime, and maybe you are familiar with images such as these, the fighters of the women's protection units that liberated the region from the Assad regime, that defended it against attacks of the Islamic State, and today against attacks of the Turkish regime. But lesser known than, let's say, the war component that has characterized the history of this autonomous region, Rojava, in the northern part of Syria, are images like these. One of the people's parliaments in the city of Gamishlo, an old theater of the Assad regime, turned into an alternative parliament. An alternative parliament for a society that is very strongly structured on local self-governance, with an emphasis on gender equality and communal economy. The political model of Rojava essentially puts most power in the smallest political component. So the commune, the local neighborhood commune, has more to say than the municipality. The municipality has more to say than the cantonal government. The cantonal government has more to say than the transcantonal government. So the layers of governance are very similar to what we know in a context like the Netherlands or even Belgium. Even though Belgium has its own quite complex political system, is essentially reversed. The smallest political component has more power than the largest political component. So here you see an example where the theater, which is still used as a theater, is at the same time used as this alternative local municipal parliament. And essentially what Rojava has tried to achieve is what they refer to as a democracy without the state, a stateless democracy. So focused on self-governance rather than on state centralized organization of power. And as the movement the Kurdish movement had been involved with the New World Summit from very early on, they invited me and my team to travel to the autonomous region various times and commissioned us to make a new parliament, a new public parliament, inspired by this model of stateless democracy, inspired by the struggle, this revolution that brought Rojava its autonomy. So what you see here is the start of the construction of this parliament that was developed in very close collaboration with Amina Osse, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Rojava at the time, with who we essentially decided that the parliament that we would make for Rojava, the first permanent parliament that we have made, a stateless parliament for a stateless democracy, that it would be a public parliament as a public space, a parliament that is not separated from the people that it represents, but is literally a people's parliament. And as you can see in the surrounding area, we have extended an old park of the Assad regime that is now growing around this public parliament, which in various ways reflects the key ideas of the Rojava revolution. First of all, that of self-governance. So the center of the parliament is empty. The proximity of people using the parliament to the center is as close as possible, essentially creating an image of collective self-representation rather than individual representation. Surrounding this circular center are various pillars. The pillars mention key terms from the social contract, which is essentially the constitution of Rojava. So terms like self-governance, gender equality, communal economy, essentially a kind of spatial manifesto, the pillars of the revolution that surround this central space. And the rooftop is formed by fragments of flags that depict the stars and suns, a kind of ideological planetarium that relates to all the different organizations that lead to this project of political self-governance. So here we see we have an example from the work of the New World Summit, which manifests as a sculpture, as a monument, as a space that symbolizes political ideas. But at the same time, it's also a place where these political ideas are put into practice. So it is a space that is very much exists between artistic imagination and political practice. They exist in this kind of continuous, intimate dialogue, which I think is characteristic for the way that I approach my work. Here, for those who visit the Van Abbe Museum, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven in the Netherlands has been a really important partner in the project of developing this parliament. And together with Kurdish diaspora in the Netherlands, we transformed one of the spaces in the museum into an alternative parliament, modeled after the parliament in Rojava. A stateless parliament is not limited to the geography in which it is created. It can duplicate as a kind of embassy, as a nomadic form. And in this case, it was also a question of how we could introduce the revolutionary politics of the Rojava Revolution in contexts outside of Rojava, and to see how we could transform existing institutions, inseminate alternative ideas on politics that could also impact and influence and inspire alternative forms of culture. So this is a project that was titled Museum as Parliament, rethinking the museum as a space of public assembly. It opened in 2018, parallel to the parliament in Rojava, and it will remain part of the museum until 2022. We continue to program events and gatherings together with the Kurdish Cultural Council of the city of Eindhoven. So that took a moment because it's also a project that has been developed over quite a long period of time. But I hope it gives something of a sense of how the relationship between power and art can take very different forms depending on the kind of ideology or the kind of political formation we're dealing with. In the case of the Rojava Revolution, we're dealing with a political movement, a revolutionary movement, also one with a strong utopian tendency that embraces the dialogue between art and culture and political imagination to rethink infrastructures and forms of gathering that shape our day-to-day life. I see I have 10 minutes left, so I will introduce 2 more examples a little bit more quickly, just to give you a sense of how this organizational art practice, this approach to artworks as a form of, this approach to organizations as a form of artworks as parliament, now the artwork as campaign, as political campaign, how it has influenced some of my other work as well. Here an example, New Unions. New Unions is an artistic and political campaign, as I already said, founded in 2016, that creates spaces of assembly for pan-European transnational movements in the European context. It was very much a response to the Brexit referendum, which you will remember was waged between the Leave and Remain campaign, to leave from the European Union, to remain from the European Union. And I felt that the Leave-Remain dichotomy in some ways is a very similar dichotomy as the us versus them dichotomy. It is this creation of an opposition in which neither position can be fully supported. So the Leave campaign was, of course, supported by very much right-wing leaning political parties that want to return to a kind of mythical origins of the United Kingdom as a great imperial power and whatnot. And on the other hand, you had the Leave campaign. It was very much supported by the bureaucratic elite, which has left, unfortunately, a terrible history of austerity politics against countries like Greece, that were literally expropriated from their livelihood, from their national property and infrastructure. So the New Unions campaign instead wanted to challenge this Leave Remain dichotomy. What could be a third scenario? Instead of only having Leave or Remain, can we not invest, in this case through the imaginative space of art, in what would be a third and a fourth and a fifth option: a feminist union, an ecological union, a transnational union, a stateless union? So we invited, in this space that you saw here, this kind of slightly dystopian looking space of the black stars either sinking in the ground or emerging from them, the symbols of a European crisis, in European Union in crisis and in transformation. We invited various transnational political parties and movements, from feminist initiative in Sweden to the popular unity candidacy in Catalonia that you can see here, to propose this, to generate these alternative scenarios, to fight this hostage over our imagination that political regimes tend to impose, to demand alternative scenarios and possibilities of continuing the necessity of fighting for transnational forms of politics, for a planetary form of politics. That also led to very close collaborations with pan-European movements like DiEM25, the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, that has this fast forward logo that was designed by composer Brian Eno, which for me had very strong constructivist associations. These two wedges, the red wedges, of course, immediately evokes the work of artists like Elizitsky. And this wedge became an important component of the work that I did together with DiEM25, translated into the stars of the European Union, the stars in a moment of crisis, in a moment of transformation, that then spatialized into the assemblist installations in which the gatherings of DiEM25, which was founded by Yanis Varoufakis, the former Minister of Finance of Greece, would take place. So here you see that we did not only invite political movements inside the theaters and art institutions, but we also worked directly, or I also worked directly in the emergent political movements, emergent pan-European movements like that of DiEM25. That is, let's say, the more concrete part of the New Unions campaign. There's also a more speculative, maybe utopian component to the campaign. For example, in propositions like these, to transform abandoned sports stadiums in Greece, like the Faliro volleyball stadium, into alternative spaces of political assembly, into new, out of architectures of crisis, to build new infrastructures of transnational political assembly. And that sometimes became very concrete, like here in Poland, a project that we did as the New Unions campaign called Unionizing the Polish Parliament, literally quadrupling the existing Polish Parliament into this circular form, where you can see the original banner from the national parliament slowly mutating, transforming into new symbols of transnational politics, building from a national symbolism to a transnational symbolism. We did something similar in collaboration with the Scottish independence movement, which of course wants to separate for a large part from the United Kingdom, but wants to remain part of the EU. And with the Scottish independence movement, we conceptualized this alternative parliament on a decommissioned oil rig, which is located exactly on the limits between the territorial waters of Scotland and the territorial waters of the European member states, European mainland, and as such kind of is built exactly on the point of two overlapping political geographies. It's as much Scottish as it is European, emerging from the decommissioned oil rig as a kind of transnational or interstate parliament. You can see the design for the inside here, of course, built on the image of the Scottish flag, surrounded by the stars that are characteristic of the New Unions campaign. Not all of these were realized, obviously, but here you see a construction of the Scottish European Parliament in the Centre for Contemporary Art of Glasgow, in a way pre-enacting the possibility of such a parliament to come into being. So the campaign, the New Unions campaign, in that sense, is very much in between political imagination, artistic imagination, and political reality. At some points, the assemblies and alternative political headquarters, like you see here in the in an old theater in Palermo, the Garibaldi Theater in Palermo. In some cases, they proposed possibilities, alternative mappings, symbols, flags, spaces of gathering that might not yet have been realized, like the Scottish European Parliament. In some cases, they hosted the actual assemblies with political movements we want to support and that also inspire this work in trying to create these alternative transnational political horizons. Now, if I would have had a few minutes more, I would have talked about a lawsuit that I'm currently working on with human rights lawyer Jan Vermon. It's a lawsuit against Facebook. It's called Collectivize Facebook, an attempt to prosecute Facebook for its undermining of the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals. employing users as unpaid data workers through their infringement on privacy and their implication in forms of mass surveillance. The fact that Facebook advises authoritarian regimes like the Duterte regimes in the Philippines directly. All of these are reasons for lawyer Jan Vermon and me to start this lawsuit against Facebook, demanding that Facebook has to be recognized as a public domain that should be placed under public ownership, not nationalized, but placed under ownership of its 2.5 billion users, transforming the Facebook corporation into a new transnational cooperative of 2.5 billion people. And I still not going to talk about it very long, but I still found it an important project to mention because, of course, in the context of the current pandemic, possibilities of gathering in assembly the way that I described projects from the past years, of course, is not possible. And due to our isolation, those who have the privilege to enter through computer screens and phones in online spaces have become increasingly dependent of trillion-dollar companies like Facebook, but also companies like Amazon, which have made huge profits in the past months. So we felt running this lawsuit at this moment was extremely crucial to reclaim these trillion-dollar companies as forms of public property, to challenge the master narrative of private property for that of communal collective property instead. And for those of you who are interested in participating, because at this moment it's not possible to join gatherings in our alternative parliaments due to COVID, but you can join in the assembly of this lawsuit, this attempt to reclaim the means of production over trillion-dollar companies like Facebook. On collectivize.org, you can read the full indictment that we will be filing at the UN Human Rights Council, at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in September next year. But you can also become a co-claimant. It's a collective action lawsuit, meaning that if you sign, the lawsuit will be filed at the UN with your name, including thousands of others, showing the willingness to take control over these infrastructures, which in the case of the trillion-dollar companies have grown to have a disproportional impact on public life and public well-being. So this is a bit of a shift of my organizational art practice, in the sense that the alternative parliament or the new unions campaign are very much about conceptualizing, visualizing new alternative infrastructures, whereas here it's really about also bringing the fight to an existing infrastructure, to that of Facebook, but then pushing for the imagination of what a collectivized Facebook could or should be. How are we going to govern Facebook? Could a collectivized Facebook be the beginning of a new transnational form of politics that goes beyond the corporation and beyond the traditional form of the nation state? So I hope that that this provided something of an introduction, both to my artistic practice, my methodology between propaganda research, mapping the relation between oppressive forms of power and art, and on the other hand, propaganda work, which is specifically invested in creating spaces, alternative narratives to counter these dominant propagandas, but also to propagate hybrid, sometimes utopian realities into being.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas. I think it was really, for me, very interesting. If people want to ask questions, they can raise their hands. And I think also on Facebook, Claire will have an eye on that. So also there people can ask questions. But maybe to start with, I was wondering if you could say something about the current state of affairs in Rojava. How are things going there? How is it? Like, when were you there for the last time? Because you said the Turks are attacking it. So I'm wondering, like, the last film festival, you were also in Rotterdam with a group of filmmakers from there. Maybe you can say something about what's going on there. How is life?
Well, I mean, I was there the last time in April 2018. And that was a few months after the Turkish government had invaded Rojava and took part of it, Afrin, which is the western canton, under its control, and that remains occupied until the day of today. The remaining territory, which is still the majority of the territory, remains under the control of the Rojava autonomous government, but of course surrounded by the Assad regime, by the Turkish regime. It is not is a difficult, it's extremely conflictual, context, and struggle for things like water, basic resources that have often been cut off as a form of warfare against the Kurdish communities. These are things that are being faced in daily life. After years of fight against Islamic State, now it's mainly against the Turkish regime. But at this moment, the situation is relatively stable in this kind of Cold War type of situation. And artists from Rojava, like the Rojava Film Commune that you mentioned, are currently actively touring across the world with films made in Rojava of new generation of filmmakers telling the story of their revolution, of the society that they're trying to create. A lot of experimental films as well that are less directly ideologically charged, so to say. Against all odds, many of the key ideas of stateless democracy remain in practice day after day. So it's a situation that remains critical, and that at the same time is also militantly committed to the alternative that it tried to bring into being.
Yeah, that's very good to hear. Of course, it's also sad that the Turks are there, but at least for the moment, people are safe. I saw a comment in the comment sections. So it's Johannes Obert who was mentioning ads should be banned from the internet as a matter of basic human rights. It's so good to see someone did not forget Cambridge Analytica and the damage they have done. We really need justice to function so we can deal with all this matter while informing people. I don't really see it as a question, but maybe it's a nice remark. Maybe
Yeah.
to.
I mean,
Yeah.
I would generally agree with all of these
Yeah.
with all of these points.
There are ads, I think, or there are programs you can use to add all comments. But one question I had, and it's also because today I was discussing it with my students. We talked about détournement and we talked about the situationists. And when you were talking about propaganda, like at least in the early years of the situationists, you also describe détournement as a way of propaganda. They say we need like art as propaganda to really transform the world, to change the world. And I was thinking when you were talking about propaganda, when you were talking about the parliaments you were doing, like in a way, which I just realized now, maybe I'm also wrong, but you also copy the formal elements of state branding, for example. So in a way, it's also propaganda or a détournement of what is how a state works. So talking about propaganda, I was asking or wondering in which way propaganda is also a matter of that artists can use, and then looking to these avant-gardes, in which way it can still function to change society for the good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I would say that's an accurate observation, certainly in relation to the examples of the New World Summit and the new unions. They very much appropriate components that belong to the traditional, let's say maybe more traditional trajectories of statecraft, like the parliament, the embassy, the flag, as in these components are certainly present, and from them the parliaments derive a certain legitimacy, lay a claim to power, even though they are simultaneously very clearly another kind of parliament. And that, of course, also already plays into the shape and form, the fact that our parliaments never have clear centers and kind of oppose the idea of individual representation or hierarchical spatial organization. But it's true, there is a kind of continuous interplay between language of power that we associate with power and its appropriation, its détournement in favor of emancipatory or transformative political ideas. That's totally true. I think you froze, Godard. Or maybe I'm the one who's offline, but at this moment, I see you frozen and slowly returning.
Hoi.
Ah,
Yeah.
so it was not me. You are still there.
Yeah, I was still there. I don't see questions on Facebook, and also no real questions in the YouTube comments. So, and nobody raising hands. So
The raising hands option, I also never found where it is.
Yeah, I don't see it now either, but I'm the host, so maybe that's why. Ah, Johannes is on YouTube. Hang in there.
Hang in there. Okay, let's.
Thomas van Kouwenbergen on YouTube asks, what brings you chose such an architecture as parliament?
What brings me to such an architecture as parliament?
I think so. Yes.
I mean, I'm not sure if the question is like what brings me to the form of the parliament, or it brings me. I guess it's really about the architectural design and such. I think in our parliaments, constructivist language and constructivist heritage is extremely important. As we were talking with Godard also a moment ago, this a language that belongs to a history of utopia, however paradoxical that might sound, a language that in many ways still has this, still embodies the capability of world making, of collective world making, not taking the world as it is as a given, but thinking of art as something that contributes to the collective endeavor of making worlds. So this has often been the reference to constructivist art, and architecture has continued to be an important component. In some other works that I didn't have a chance to talk about, that is a little bit of a different case, but certainly in the case of the New World Summit, this has been of continuous importance. Although the assembly, the political assembly, that is central to the New World Summit projects, is an architecture that is, of course, as old as a group of people who sit in a circle and engage in collective forms of decision making and exchange. So you could say the architecture is partially a visual spatial component, the architecture, but it's also the architecture of bodies. And without that architecture of bodies, there's of course also no parliament. So I tend to think of architecture in that sense not only as a fixed component, but also as this more performative bodily component to the work.
Okay, so Godard got kicked out of the meeting, of the webinar. So I don't see any more questions. So maybe we should end it. Ah, there he is.
Right.
Hey.
Back. Yeah.
I just said I don't see any more questions.
Yeah. No, perfect. Yeah, I will watch the video back when done to hear the answer to my question. No, but I think we said all about it, and as you mentioned, I think it's a beautiful introduction to your practice. And I think it's also interesting to hear this, and if people visit the Van Abbe Museum, for example, or other projects that they have this in mind. So yeah, if there aren't any more questions, I'm looking to hands. No, then I think this is it. So thank you very much, Jonas. And talking about like Facebook, and fighting Facebook and using Facebook as a public space. I think it's interesting that this happens, that we discuss this while using the internet. So there are alternatives in using data as a free space, or at least the internet.
Yes, I must say that the posts with the YouTube link, they have very little reach, so maybe you're already on the blacklist.
Right.
All right. Thanks for having me. Have a good night.
Yeah, have
Okay.
a good night. Here you go.
Bye.
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 Ciao.